The great Canadian prairies, the tens of millions of acres of some of the world's most fertile farmland, help feed not only this country, but other nations as well. Wheat, oats, lentils, canola, and other crops, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, with a combined population of about 2.5 million people, are known as Canada's breadbasket. The two provinces are often lumped together, but in many ways they are quite different, perhaps most notably politically. Take Saskatchewan, where the two most populous cities of Saskatoon and the capital of Regina, while vibrant, are relatively small, with just 300,000 and 250,000 inhabitants respectively. There and elsewhere in the province, the Prime Minister is not well liked.
Most don't even know who the Conservative candidate is, but they don't care. They just want a Conservative.
That's the Regina Leader Post's political journalist Murray Mandrick's characterization of the typical Saskatchewanian voter. The province has taken a hard turn toward Tory blue over the course of the last 20 years, both provincially and federally. Many now consider Saskatchewan to be the most conservative province in the country. Provincially, the Liberals have not had a foothold since 1999. Premier Scott Moe's right-of-centre Saskatchewan party holds a solid majority with the NDP in opposition. The Liberals don't have a single seat. And federally, the last Liberal bastion, the much-loved 26-year veteran Liberal Ralph Goodale, was ousted from his riding of Regina-Wascana in 2019. Since then, the Conservatives have held all 14 federal seats in the province, and most insiders think the outcome is unlikely to be different this time around.
Because nothing has really changed. The anger has set in towards the Liberals, the Trudeau name, the Trudeau government, and there's no undoing that. You can't just ever unscramble that egg.
So in the 2021 election, the chance of the Liberals doing well in Saskatchewan are very, very remote. In fact, they may end up with Alberta-type responses as we have in the last election, pretty close in the last election. Prime Minister Trudeau is very unpopular in the province of Saskatchewan.
Ken Coates is a professor and historian and is a longtime political analyst. He expects Trudeau and other Liberal brass will spend very little time in Saskatchewan as the PM seeks the 15 seats needed for his coveted majority. He contends, why would they bother?
This election will be decided essentially in Montreal, southern Ontario, and the lower mainland of British Columbia. That's where the election is going to be waged, and that's where the fight's going to take place. And Saskatchewan is as much an afterthought as Prince Edward Island. They obviously will have candidates. There'll be a little bit of noise here and there. In this particular year, the government of Canada has been making promises everywhere. So one could anticipate some promises in Saskatchewan as well. But my guess is the people of Saskatchewan will be unmoved.
Murray Mandrick agrees it'll be a complete shock if the Liberals make any headway in Saskatchewan. In fact, his concern is that voters are seeming inclined to move even harder right. He expects to see support increase for more extreme right-wing parties, like Maxime Bernier's The People's Party of Canada and the new Maverick Party, which has its roots in the idea of Western separatism. He finds the extent of Western anger and sense of alienation concerning. The movement may have started in Alberta, but it's definitely spread to the province of Saskatchewan.
Oh, it's real. And people need to know and understand that it's real. I'm scared by it. I hear a provincial premier using terms like, we're part of this country for now. What the hell does that mean, sir? Should you be saying that as a provincial premier?
Prairie farmers are not necessarily talking separation, but it seems few are impressed with Justin Trudeau's track record. So is it fair to say you will not be voting Liberal in this election?
It's fair to say that I'm not going to vote Liberal this election.
One of the reasons the Liberals are so unpopular in Saskatchewan is that the citizens here, in particular farmers, feel largely ignored. They feel the feds have little understanding and pay only lip service to the issues they face. For example, this year's drought.
Just get out of the way here, Heather.
Jared Gust is a member of a 5-generation Saskatchewan farming family. They own a 16,000-acre grain operation. While the federal government recently announced a $100 million influx of cash to allay costs associated with this season's crippling drought, Gust says it's not enough. And while he says his farm will survive this season, he's concerned many others will not. And there are other reasons why Western farmers feel cheated by the feds.
They just don't seem to understand what's going on out west. They give us unnecessary taxes. They impose things like the carbon tax, which we can't pass along to our customers. They make food costs higher for Canadians. They make unnecessary regulations. It's just something that they don't seem to understand, sort of the Western sensibilities. They don't try. It's just sort of, we're flyover country for them, and they don't put in the effort.
Will Justin Trudeau still be the Prime Minister after the coming federal election?
John Gormley is a former member of Parliament and radio host who loves to talk politics. He's also a staunch Conservative. He will likely support Aaron O'Toole, even though he admits the Conservative leader has not resonated with voters so far.
Again, I think that's just people don't know him. And he seems to be, again, to the extent I've had anything to do with him in an interview, he seems to be very clever, he seems to be well motivated in these things, but I don't know the measure of Aaron O'Toole. So in many respects, I find myself, just as a political observer, saying, I don't know what to make of him at this point. And that's a challenge when you're going into an election and voters aren't sure of you. I don't know what he does.
I see the lines lighting
Got the reality check. Going to be line 2. Listen to your phone. Keep your radio all the way off. You were line 2.
Even ahead of the election announcement, Gormley has been conducting a regular snap poll on his show. Consistently, callers have shown that Trudeau will remain the PM.
A number of you prefaced it with, unfortunately, but 89% of you said, yes, Mr. Trudeau is still going to be the Prime Minister.
He agrees that is a strong possibility. But he says Trudeau's support will not come from Saskatchewan. And that is partly because he feels, like the farmer we talked to, that the feds are deliberately hurting Saskatchewanians, whom he thinks are unfairly burdened with measures like the carbon tax. So do the Liberals have a hope in Saskatchewan?
No. Here's an issue. The carbon tax on fossil fuels, right? So, but farmers will, of course, be exempt for the fuel they use when they're out in the field, this sort of thing. Oh, they want to ship their grain. Oh, we didn't think of that. Okay, now we'll exempt that. Drying their grain on a wet year is done with natural gas. Farmers, just on the carbon tax a month, between $5,000 and $25,000 in tax a month.
In spite of his objections to Liberal policies, Gormley still maintains this election is Trudeau's to lose, although he's not convinced the PM can pull off a majority. And stalwart Liberals like Darren Lamoureux, who was leader of the provincial Liberal Party in Saskatchewan and whose brother is a popular Liberal MP in Manitoba, admits there's a long road ahead for the party to regain any standing at all in Saskatchewan. There is a pretty widely held consensus that the Liberals don't have a chance in Saskatchewan.
That's fair.
Do you agree with that?
That's a fair assumption.
But Lamoureux does think this campaign will be different from the race of 2019. He says Conservative support has been flagging in the province, and the NDP under Jagmeet Singh has failed to make an impact. Lamoureux thinks the Liberals are poised to make a comeback in Saskatchewan, particularly in Ralph Goodale's old riding of Regina-Wascana, with the Liberal candidate of Sean McEachern.
To say that there isn't a chance, there is, because the NDP vote won't be here this time. So they might just decide that, Justin's done a good job during the pandemic. We miss having that MP in Ottawa. And they might come out in droves and vote for Sean.
Ask an NDP party member and you'll get a similar answer, but with the optimistic lens pointed in their party's direction. NDPers admit the province is the Conservatives to lose, but believe any flips will go their way.
Obviously, the last election, it was a clean sweep for the Conservatives in Saskatchewan, but I don't believe we're going to see the same thing here this time, particularly with the numbers for Aaron O'Toole that we're seeing all across the country, but even in the prairies in Alberta and Saskatchewan, traditionally real powerhouses, strongholds for Conservatives.
Sally Hauser is the former chief of staff to Saskatchewan's NDP leader, Ryan Miley, and says there are several ridings that the New Democrats could pick up in the province, seats that have historically gone back and forth between the major parties. Regina Louvain is one.
and then also Saskatoon West, and then Does Nothing Miss Nippy Churchill up north is always a bit of a toss-up. That's a wild card. It has in the past 25 years gone Conservative, Liberal, and New Democrat. Right. But Regina Leuven, I know, is one that the NDP will be really focusing hard on. You've got an excellent candidate, Tria Donaldson, there, who was nominated a few weeks ago. She's been out knocking doors every day, and again, that's one that often flips back and forth between Conservative and New Democrats. And again, I think just given the Conservatives' polling and numbers right now, that's one that you'll see come back to the NDP.
From a business perspective, the head of the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce says he doesn't care who wins the election, but would like to see all levels of government cooperate more.
The reality of it is, and we all need to be big kids and say, this is who Canada elected to be our federal government. We must and will work with them. We've been very successful as a business community doing that. There's more we need to do, but we need our municipal and our provincial and our federal government political leaders to work together. This is one country with a significant range of issues. We need them to come together now much more than ever.
And has that been a disappointment for you, that it seems like there's such a divide?
It's a huge divide, and it's terribly disappointing. And it has left literally billions of dollars in Ottawa that has not come to Saskatchewan that could be.
Put your hands together and welcome our local host chief. Ladies and gentlemen, also a chicken dancer extraordinaire, Chief Captain Dillon.
We are gaining strength one day at a time. But as we move forward, we got a lot of healing to do.
All parties, all leaders, and all candidates across the country are painfully aware of the tragedy of recent revelations of unmarked graves at former residential schools.
All we ask of all of you listening is that you stand by us as we heal and we get stronger, and that we all must put down our ignorance and accidental racism of not addressing the truth that this country has with Indigenous people.
It's a particularly difficult reality in Saskatchewan, where the largest site was discovered just weeks ago. 751 graves at Cowessess First Nation, 150 kilometers from Regina. While most political watchers are questioning the need for a federal election right now, as the nation and the world continue to deal with the fallout from the pandemic, there are some who say there is one positive side to the timing, and that is that Indigenous issues will be front and center.
There needs to be a strong focus on Indigenous issues. What the solutions look like for that, not necessarily us proposing them, but committing to partnering with First Nation groups on their initiatives. I think this will be a different election in a good way. Parties have always had a platform where, they devote some time to Indigenous issues and Indigenous policy. But I think for the first time in my life, at least, this will probably be an election dominated by those issues. And I think that's good. I think that it's a point in time now in our country's history where we need this, and we need to figure out what does reconciliation look like and how does government commit to being that willing partner.
Winnipeg is Manitoba's largest city with just over 760,000 residents. It's also home to the country's largest urban Indigenous population, followed by Saskatoon. According to Indigenous activists and voters, there is much work to be done, work that will benefit not only their communities, but Canada as a whole.
We hope that things like the National Daycare Plan would be put in place. We'd like to see social housing restored, and I am particularly interested in a national food policy because, we've got people dying at a young age. There's also the issue of water safety, security. There's a whole host of issues that I think need to be driving this election. The Prime Minister in the past has promised to alleviate, the water crises in over 100 communities, and nothing significantly, impactful has been done. So we're watching and waiting for that.
Stick to his words, I guess, what he told, what he's going to do for us Native people, and that's about it. He's got to keep his promises. Yeah, that's about it.
And you feel like he hasn't?
No, he hasn't.
For many voters in Manitoba, as is the case across the country, Indigenous issues loom large this election. But there's another major concern, according to Winnipeg journalist Shannon Sampert.
More now in the last 2 weeks has been its drought, the agricultural drought. This is becoming a crisis, and it's like the 5th year of a crisis. And so climate change is becoming first and foremost in everyone's minds as well, within the city and outside of the city as well, of Winnipeg and Manitoba overall. So agriculture and the climate change are going to be a huge issue for Manitobans.
In Manitoba, the political landscape is quite different from Saskatchewan's. It's more of a mixed bag across the 14 ridings in the province. Described as a microcosm of the country, all 3 parties are a presence here. In the 2019 federal election, incumbents reigned supreme with 11 MPs being returned to Parliament Hill. But the 3 losses were suffered by Trudeau's Liberals, and all in Winnipeg. The Liberals had 7 of 8 seats in the city after the 2015 red tide, but they were reduced to 4 after the last election. And while there's an expectation that Trudeau will be working hard not only to retain his current standing in the province, but win back the seats he lost last time. But some insiders believe here too, like in Saskatchewan, there won't be much point.
When you look at the races here and you look at kind of the overall dynamics, I don't see as many ultra-competitive races or races to watch that are really going to, mean the difference between the Liberals winning a minority or a majority, or the Conservatives making big gains, or anything like that. I think the road to a Liberal majority, or the road to even Conservative minority, I think would definitely bypass Manitoba. If I'm Justin Trudeau, I'm going to be spending as much time as possible in the Lower Mainland in BC, or in the 905, or in parts of Quebec where there are a lot more opportunities to pick up large numbers of seats. And it's not something where, like in Manitoba, just looking at the overall dynamic of it. In fact, I think the last 2 elections, the Prime Minister did spend a fair bit of time here because they did pick up some seats when they won in 2015, and they worked hard to defend some of those, which were not traditional Liberal seats in 2019. But I wouldn't be surprised if they spent a very minimal amount of time here.
Curtis Brown is a pollster who's been watching this election closely. While his research shows that the NDP is always a bit of a wild card and has pockets of support around the province and may pick up a seat or 2, for the most part, he predicts that not a lot will change politically in Manitoba.
Curtis, it sounds like you wouldn't be surprised if nothing at all changed in Manitoba.
Yeah, that is a fair point. I think it's interesting because we don't have a lot of seats here, and a lot of the seats that we do have, it's a lot of a rehash or a repeat. It's a lot of repeat candidates who are going to be going back up against each other again, whether that's in Winnipeg South or Winnipeg South Centre. The Charleswood riding. But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't look like it's going to be, something really fundamental would have to happen. There'd have to be a pretty big shift, I think, for some of these seats really to change.
Even Liberals agree it will be a tall order for the party to make significant gains in Manitoba. But there are some interesting races to watch, including the Winnipeg riding with possibly the longest name ever, Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
There's a number of constituencies where there will be close contests. For example, where Marty Morantz is currently the Member of Parliament, and Doug Olofsson was before, and Doug is now back there, and he's working hard. It's going to be very close.
John Gerard is an MLA from Manitoba and Liberal strategist who says he's proud of the way Trudeau has handled the pandemic.
The CERB program basically saved a lot of people who would have been in really big trouble. And programs for businesses working with what's in the provinces have helped a lot of businesses. I've talked to business owners who are really appreciative of how it was designed. And coming from Manitoba, where the provincial government has seemed to sort of hold back and be not willing to spend very much, the activities of the federal government have been well received. Mm-hmm. I think that in contrast to Brian Pallister, who's really had a lot of negative reviews of his handling of the pandemic, Justin Trudeau has done reasonably well, and it's been received positively across the country.
In spite of this positive point of view, Justin Trudeau is not likely to win his majority in either Saskatchewan or Manitoba, insiders say. So what gains can the Conservative leader, Aaron O'Toole, hope to make in Manitoba?
Let's ensure that we have a government that serves the people as opposed to serving the friends of Justin Trudeau.
Well, he faces a number of issues. As John Gerard mentioned, one problem leading up to the campaign was the negative effect Manitoba's provincial leader has had on the Conservative Party federally. Conservative Premier Brian Pallister's popularity has plummeted, thanks in part to his government's handling of the pandemic and Indigenous issues. There was concern that the brand halo effect would hurt Aaron O'Toole. But days before the writ was dropped, Pallister announced he would be resigning.
After almost 10 years as leader of our party and more than 5 years as our province's premier, I believe that now is the time for a new leader and a premier to take our province forward.
Good news for Conservatives, and no surprise to political observers who have watched Pallister implode in the last few years he's been in power.
He had little choice. Mr. Pallister's the writing was on the wall for him.
Will this help the federal Conservatives at all?
It's not going to hurt them. I mean, the Conservatives federally are going to get a little bit of a boost, I think, if he steps away.
Nonetheless, the Conservatives' fortunes are not likely to shift greatly in Manitoba. Aaron O'Toole has consistently fared poorly in polls. In an early August poll, which asked voters who would make the best prime minister, O'Toole placed last of the three major parties in every region surveyed. But his supporters say they are not worried.
Do you think that will change over the course of the campaign?
Yeah, totally. I absolutely think it will change. As research also shows that Mr. O'Toole is relatively unknown at this current point in time, but it also demonstrates that when people get to know Mr. O'Toole, as they will throughout an election campaign more so than ever, Mr. O'Toole is a veteran, as a blue collar kind of guy. Support for him boosts in a pretty wide margin once people get to understand what he stands for, what kind of prime minister he might be. So I definitely think if it's a longer election, things could really change in favor for the Conservatives.
Nate Clark is Brian Pallister's former chief of staff. He's confident that the Conservatives can hold on to the 2 Winnipeg seats they won in 2019. The NDP in Manitoba is also confident. The party gained 1 seat last time, and as their leader, Jagmeet Singh, becomes more well-known, the hope is that they will continue to make inroads.
We're really hopeful. We're expecting to see gains all over the country based on the numbers, and Jagmeet is phenomenally popular. People really like him. I think that's a huge advantage over the last time. There was a little bit of a get-to-know-you sort of sentiment the last time around, and now he's proven himself. He's fought really hard for benefits that so many of us have enjoyed. The higher CERB, protections for small businesses, and I don't think that people will soon forget that.
New Democrats are watching Winnipeg North closely, hoping to unseat incumbent Kevin Lamoureux, but admit it'll take a lot of work. Other analysts believe there is a slim chance the New Democrats will take that riding, but say Winnipeg South could potentially swing.
And that's held by Terry Duguid. And Winnipeg South has been the bellwether riding for many years for the entire outcome of the federal election. When it last was Conservative, it was held by Rod Bernouge, and he was elected for the Conservatives when Harper won his first victory. And Rod Bernouge had beat a fairly powerful cabinet minister, Reg Alcock. So it swings, Winnipeg South swings according to how the country's going. So if Terry Duguid for the Liberals holds Winnipeg South, I would be quite confident that Justin Trudeau will win the election.
But will he win a majority? Many observers say it is looking increasingly likely that Trudeau may wind up with essentially the same numbers in the House of Commons that he has now. Ken Coates is extremely cynical about the reasons for holding an election at all.
I'm actually offended by this election. We've had ridiculous elections in the past by all parties who call elections to sort of, court particular political advantage. This one is offensive. And I say this on a nonpartisan basis, because all of our three parties major parties have not distinguished themselves over the last couple of years. But we do not need an election right now. Parliament is being ignored by the government. They have not installed in any of their major legislation, massive pieces of legislation, massive funding has been authorized. The United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples got through major pieces of legislation. There's no argument for this election, save the vanity and self-interest of the Liberal Party and the Prime Minister of this country. And we still have a pandemic. In this context, it's reprehensible that we would be considering spending the money and the time and the effort for an election that is completely and totally unnecessary.
Ken Coates is also entirely unimpressed by the speed with which Justin Trudeau gets himself in front of the cameras and poses for photo ops. For example, when he went to the Cowessess gravesite right after the discovery was made.
That very carefully crafted image of him sitting down with a teddy bear and putting it down on an unmarked grave was gratuitous. It was actually, I'm pandering to whom? I mean, it's a disgraceful effort to sort of capitalize on the really deep sadness, the grief and the sorrow within the community. This is not about the Prime Minister. This was not about the Prime Minister and his sorrow or his apologies or his grief or whatever it happened to be. But he did manage to sort of make it look that way. And I talked to a couple of Indigenous leaders in the next week after that, and they weren't sort of angry about it. They just resigned to it, resigned to sort of the showboating sort of side of it. Mm-hmm. And we don't need that in the country. We need serious work on serious issues.
He's clearly not a fan, but enough of a realist to understand that Trudeau could well still be his Prime Minister at the end of this campaign. I'm Pam Seidel for CPAC.